you are presented with a choice. Insist you are innocent, or confess. Beg forgiveness and implicate others, and you will go free. Do you give a false confession, or will you choose your inevitable death? These were the choices that victims faced in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 up until May 1693. During that time, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft. 20 of these were executed. The reason? Accusations fueled by xenophobia, religious extremism, and long-brewing social tensions between families. These are the Salem Witch Trials. Salem was settled in 1626 by a group of English Protestants called Puritans. In the medieval and early modern eras, many religions taught that the devil could give people known as witches the power to harm others in return for their loyalty. While the witchcraft craze that had begun in the 1300s and had ended in the 1600s had begun to fade out across much of Europe by the mid-17th century, they continued on the fringes of Europe and in the American colonies. This event in Salem became a brief outburst of a sort of hysteria in the New World, while the practice was already waning in most of Europe. The explanation of this onset was derived solely from the following local circumstances. In 1689, English monarchs William and Mary started a war with France in the American colonies. The conflict ravaged many regions and sent refugees into the county of Essex, and specifically Salem Village, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The displaced people placed a strain on Salem's already tumultuous daily life, which was filled with turmoil with the Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers. The Puritan belief and culture was that women were inherently sinful and more susceptible to damnation than men were. Women who did not conform to the norms of Puritan society were also more likely to be the target of accusation, especially those who were unmarried or did not have children. Nonetheless, prior to the trials in July 1689, Samuel Parris became the first ordained minister. Cousins Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, the daughter and the niece, respectively, of Reverend Samuel Parris, began to have fits described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease by John Hale, the minister of the nearby town of Beverly. The girls acted strangely. They screamed, threw things about the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. According to the eyewitness account of Reverend Deodat Lawson, a former minister in Salem Village. Shortly after, Elizabeth Hubbard, Susanna Sheldon, Mary Warren, and Elizabeth Booth all started to experience the same symptoms. A doctor, historically assumed to be William Griggs, could find no physical evidence of any ailment and stated that they might have been bewitched. The first three people accused and arrested for allegedly afflicting the victims were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, with Tituba being the first. Sarah Good was a destitute woman accused of witchcraft because of her reputation. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church meetings, following her remarriage to an indentured servant. Tituba, an enslaved South American Indian woman from the West Indies, likely became a target because of her ethnic differences from most of the other villagers. Brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft, they were interrogated for several days, starting on March 1st, 1692, then sent to jail. In March, others were accused of witchcraft. Martha Corey, child Dorothy Good, and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Village, and Rachel Clinton in nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey had expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations, and thus drawn attention. The charges against her and Rebecca Nurse deeply troubled the community because Martha Corey was a full covenanted member of the church in Salem Village, as was Rebecca Nurse in the church in Salem Town. If such upstanding people could be witches, the townspeople thought, then anybody could be a witch. Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, was only 4 years old but was not exempted from questioning by the magistrates. In Ipswich, Rachel Clinton was arrested for witchcraft at the end of March on independent charges unrelated to the afflictions of the girls in Salem Village. The initial examinations included physical exams, where the accused were examined for unique markings, such as moles and birthmarks that were commonly believed to be associated with the devil's influence. When Sarah Cloyce and Elizabeth Bassett Proctor were arrested in April, they were brought before John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin at a meeting in Salem town. The men were both local magistrates. During the proceedings, objections by Elizabeth's husband, John Proctor, resulted in his arrest that day. Within a week, Giles Corey, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs were arrested and examined. Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs all confessed and began naming additional people as accomplices. More arrests followed. Sarah Wilds, William Hobbs, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., Mary Easty, and Edward Bishop Jr. and his wife Sarah Bishop and Mary English. On April 30th, Reverend George Burroughs, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hall, Sarah Morey, and Philip English were arrested. In May, accusations continued to pour in, but some of the suspects began to evade apprehension. Multiple warrants were issued before John Willard and Elizabeth Colson were apprehended. George Jacobs Jr. and Daniel Andrews were not caught. Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 persons accused, died in jail on May 10, 1692. Warrants were issued for 36 more people, with examinations continuing to take place in Salem Village. Sarah Dustin, Anne Sears, Bethia Carter Sr. and her daughter Bethia Carter Jr., George Jacobs Sr. and his granddaughter Margaret Jacobs, John Willard, Alice Parker, Anne Pudeator, Abigail Soames, George Jacobs Jr., Daniel Andrews, Rebecca Jacobs, Sarah Buckley, and her daughter Mary Witheridge. Also included were Elizabeth Colson, Elizabeth Hart, Thomas Farrar Sr., Roger Toothaker, Sarah Proctor, Sarah Bassett, Susanna Roots, Mary Derrich, Sarah Peace, Elizabeth Carey, Martha Carrier, Elizabeth Fosdick, Wilmot Red, Sarah Rice, Elizabeth Howe, Captain John Alden, William Proctor, John Flood, Mary Toothaker and her daughter Margaret Toothaker, and Arthur Abbott. When the Court of Oyer and Termina, which was a special type of court in English law established specifically to hear cases that are extraordinary and serious in nature, convened at the end of May, the total number of people in custody was 62. The Court of Oyer and Termina convened in Salem town on June 2, 1692. Bridget Bishop's case was the first brought to the grand jury, who endorsed all the indictments against her. Bishop was described as not living a Puritan lifestyle, for she wore black clothing and odd costumes, which was against the Puritan code. This, along with her immoral lifestyle, affirmed to the jury that Bishop was a witch. She went to trial the same day and was convicted. On June 3rd, the grand jury endorsed indictments against Rebecca Nurse and John Willard, but they did not go to trial immediately for reasons which are unclear. Bishop was executed by hanging on June 10th, 1692. Immediately following this execution, the court adjourned for 20 days until June 30th, while it sought advice from New England's most influential ministers upon the state of things as they then stood. Their collective response came back dated June 15th, and the prosecutions went on with more vigor than before. From June 30th through early July, grand juries endorsed indictments against 8 people. All 5 women were executed by hanging on July 19th, 1692. In August, grand juries indicted 4 separate individuals. Along with these 4 individuals, trial juries convicted another 4. Elizabeth Proctor, being one of them, was given a temporary stay of execution because she was pregnant. On August 19th, 1692, Martha Carrier, George Jacobs Sr., George Burroughs, John Willard, and John Proctor were executed. Mr. Burroughs in particular was carried in a cart through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech in which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer. Witches were said to not be able to recite any of the Lord's prayers. The accusers said the black man, the devil, stood and dictated this to him. As soon as he was hanged, Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, addressed himself to the people, partly to declare that Mr. Burroughs had showed that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light. And this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. In September 1692, grand juries indicted 18 more people. The grand jury failed to indict William Proctor, who was rearrested on new charges. On the 19th of September 1692, Giles Corey refused to plead at trial and was killed by peine de force et dure, a form of torture in which the subject is pressed beneath an increasingly heavy load of stones, in an attempt to make him enter a plea. 4 individuals pleaded guilty and 11 others were tried and found guilty. On September 22nd, 1692, 8 more persons were executed. Dorcas Hall was given a temporary reprieve with the support of several ministers to make a confession of being a witch. Mary Bradbury, aged 77, managed to escape with the help of family and friends. Mather quickly completed his account of the trials, Wonders of the Invisible World, and it was given to Governor Phipps when he returned from the fighting in Maine in early October. On October 29th, Judge Sewell wrote, "The court of Oyer and Terminer count themselves thereby dismissed." Perhaps this by coincidence, as Governor Phipps' own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, were among those who had been called out upon around this time. After Phipps's order, there were no more executions. In January 1693, the new Superior Court of Judicature, Court of Assize, and General Gaol Delivery convened in Salem, Essex County again. The first 5 cases tried in January 1693 were of the 5 people who had been indicted but not tried in September. All were found not guilty. Grand juries were held for many of those remaining in jail. Charges were dismissed against many, but 60 more people were indicted and tried, 3 of whom were found guilty. When Stoughton wrote the warrants for the execution of these 3 and others remaining from the previous court, Governor Phipps issued pardons, sparing their lives. In late January, early February, the court sat again in Charleston, Middlesex County, and held grand juries and tried 5 people. All were found not guilty but were not released until they paid their jail fees. Lydia Dustin died in jail on March 10th, 1693. At the end of April, the court convened in Boston, Suffolk County, and cleared Captain John Alden by proclamation. In May, the court convened in Ipswich, Essex County, and held a variety of grand juries. They dismissed charges against all but 5 people: Susanna Post, Eunice Fry, Mary Bridges Jr., Mary Barker, and William Barker Jr. They were all found not guilty at trial. This was the end to the series of trials and executions in Salem town. Many modern theories suggest the girls were suffering from epilepsy, boredom, child abuse, mental illness, or even a disease brought on by eating rye infected with fungus. According to Vox, posited that the accusers suffered from ergotism, a condition caused by eating foods contaminated with the fungus ergot. Symptoms include muscle spasms, vomiting, delusions, and hallucinations. Other theories emphasize a combination of church politics, family feuds, and hysterical children. Ultimately, the causes of the witch hunt remain subject to much debate. In August 1992, to mark the 300th anniversary of the trials, Eliezer Wiesel dedicated the Witch Trials Memorial in Salem. Finally, the town's most visited attraction, the Salem Witch Museum, attests to the public's enduring enthrallment with the 17th century hysteria. As the years went by, the colonists felt ashamed and remorseful for what had happened during the Salem Witch Trials. Since the witch trials ended, the colony also began to suffer many misfortunes such as droughts, crop failures, smallpox outbreaks, and Native American attacks, and many began to wonder if God was punishing them for their mistake. In 1706, afflicted girl Anne Putnam Jr. also issued a public apology for her role in the Salem Witch Trials, particularly in the case against her neighbor Rebecca Nurse. In 1957, the state of Massachusetts officially apologized for the Salem Witch Trials and cleared the name of some of the remaining victims not listed in the 1711 law. On October 31st, 2001, the state amended the 1957 apology and cleared the names of the remaining unnamed victims. In January of 2016, the site where the Salem Witch Trials hangings took place was officially identified as Proctor's Ledge. In 2017, on the 325th anniversary of the Salem Witch Trials, the newly built Proctor's Ledge Memorial was unveiled at the base of the ledge on Pope Street. And so we come to the end. What do you think was the cause of this mass hysteria? Was it in fact the work of the devil, or a fear of the unknown? You decide.